Lovely Storytelling. How are you doing today? We are going to be reading the Bible. Yeah, we're reading the Bible. Then we are going to be doing the Synopsis with Kimberly. Then we are going to be reading Dragon Drums with Mom. So,
what do they need to do? Hit the
bell.
Hit the ding-a-ling.
Ding-a-ling. Subscribe, hit the like button, and hit the ding-a-ling.
Okay.
I hope you enjoy the video.
Hi. How is everyone tonight? Sorry, my hair's a little wonky today. I don't know what is going on with it. All right, I'm going to be continuing in the book of Psalms. Just joking, it's Psalms. Okay, so we're going to read Psalm 3 and Psalm 4. This is the English Standard Version of the Bible. And then we're going to be finishing up chapter 4, and then however far that Mom decides that she wants to continue after that. All right, so this is chapter 3 of the book of Psalms, or also known as Psalm 3. A psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Selah. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. Selah. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Selah. Psalm 4. To the choir master with stringed instruments, a psalm of David. Answer me when I call, O God of my righteousness. You have given me relief when I was in distress. Be gracious to me and hear my prayer. O men, how long shall my honor be turned into shame? How long will you love vain words and seek after lies? Selah. But know that the Lord has set apart the godly for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him. Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent. Selah. Offer right sacrifices and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, who will show us some good? Lift up the light of your face upon us, O Lord. You have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. In peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you, O Lord, make me dwell in safety. Who wants to just go ahead and read chapter 5 also? It's only 12 verses. Let's go ahead and do it. Here is chapter 5. This is Psalm 5. To the choir master for the flutes. The last one was for stringed instruments. This one's for the flutes. A psalm of David. Give ear to my words, O Lord. Consider my groaning. Give attention to the sound of my cry, my King and my God. For to you do I pray. O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice. In the morning I prepare a sacrifice for you and watch. For you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you. The boastful shall not stand before your eyes. You hate all evildoers. You destroy those who speak lies. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man. But I, through abundance of your steadfast love, will enter your house. I will bow down toward your holy temple in the fear of you. Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness because of my enemies. Make your way straight before me. For there is no truth in their mouth. Their inmost self is destruction. Their throat is an open grave. They flatter with their tongue. Make them bear their guilt, O God. Let them fall by their own counsels. Because of the abundance of their transgressions, cast them out. For they have rebelled against you. But let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them ever sing for joy, and spread your protection over them, that those who love your name may exult in you. For you bless the righteous, O Lord. You cover them with favor as with a shield. That's the end of Psalm 5. We'll pick up with Psalm 6 in the tomorrow. I was going to say in the morning, but it'll be in the evening tomorrow. So hope you're enjoying the reading of God's Word. Again, this is the English Standard Version of the Bible. Yes, Rebecca, we miss you also. We can't wait till the next time we get to see you. Yay! At this time, I've got a lovely assistant who is going to be providing the synopsis. Here's Kimberly.
Don't forget to mention chapter 4 is like 8 chapters in one.
So, what happened in the last few chapters, we have to actually recap of the synopsis of the last one, because it's kind of important too. If you remember, he went over to that blacksmith's place to get the sapphires, and then this old-timer, as they're called, he came over and he tried to get some of the sapphires too, and they only gave him bad ones because he actually, hi Becca, he hid them in his boot and his bag. So that's what happened like a bunch of chapters ago, and we read it two live streams ago. But so why this is important is because he told it to the head harper, and he rewarded him on his resourcefulness, and he said something along the lines of, "Hey, good job, you were thinking really, really well there." And so then he was going over to this, I forget what it's called. Mom, do you remember?
What?
Primer. He went over, and I remember the name. He went over to the thing. I forget what it's called, but he went there on the dragon.
Oh, the hatching.
No, the thing before that.
Between?
No, before that.
No.
He went in between.
Up in the sky, went between, down.
And then
landed in the bowl.
Yeah, but then he went over to the festival sort of thing. What's it called?
That was, gather.
Yeah, he went over to a gather, and he remarked very unsubtly about how extremely hot it was during the day. And then it was colder during the night, so he couldn't sleep. When he did eventually get to sleep, he was woken up by Melanie. I got it right again. He was woken up by Melanie, who was gonna go take him to this hatching, again on Dragonback, because her friend flew them. So they're going over to this hatching, and that's about it, right?
That's about it.
It hasn't happened
And then we
yet.
discovered that we had read 18 pages and it was time for bed. Okay. Whoa. Right. I require chapstick. I put some on. I'm good now. It stings though. It's not chapstick. It's just moisturizer. I'm going to back up a couple of paragraphs just so that we know where we are. Apologize for having to stop midway and not knowing exactly where we were, but okay. Another dragon appeared in the air just above them, and instinctively Pimer ducked, hearing Meneley laugh at his reflex. A third and then a fourth dragon arrived, even as Cantha began to glide down to the bowl floor. By the time Pimer could slide from the Brown's shoulder to the ground, he marveled that the dragons hadn't collided midair, appearing as they had with such startling frequency. Beauty, Kimmy, Rocky, and Diver popped in above Meneley's head, caroling with excitement, and suddenly they were joined by 5 other fire lizards Pimer had never seen before. When Menely muttered worriedly about feeding fire lizards before they disrupted the weir, Fenora laughingly told them to find Miriam. She was likely to be supervising breakfast in the kitchen caverns. Siebel's nudge in his ribs reminded Pimer to thank the Brown Rider and his dragon. Then the three harpers made their way across the bowl to the brightly lit cavern. The enticing aromas of fresh claw and toasted cereals quickened their steps, Menely leading the way towards the smallest hearth, away from the bustle and hurry of weirfolk at the larger fires. "Miriam," she called, and the girl at the hearth turned, her face lighting as she recognized the new arrivals. "Menely, you came! Siebel, how are you? What have you been up to recently to get so tanned? Who's this?" Her smile disappeared as she noticed Pimer bringing up the rear, as if such a scruffy apprentice shouldn't be in such good company. "Miriam, this is Pimer. You've heard me speak of him often enough," said Menely, putting her hand on Pimer to draw him forward and closer to her. The intimacy of a guarantee of him to Miriam. "He was my first friend at the Harper Hall, as you were mine here. We've all been at Eigen Gather. Baked yesterday, frozen this morning, and very hungry." Menely let her tone drift upward plaintively. "Well, of course you're hungry," said Miriam, breaking off her stern appraisal of Pimer and turn to the hearth. She filled cups and bowls and set them out on one of the small tables with such alacrity that Pimer changed his first unflattering impression of her. I can't stop long with you. You know how things are at the weir when there's a hatching, so much to do. The important details you really have to see to yourself to be sure they're done right." She flopped gracelessly into a chair with an exaggerated sigh of relief to underscore the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. Then she ran both hands through the fringe of brown hair on her forehead, ending the gesture with pats at the neat pleat that hung down her back. Pimer eyed her with a certain skeptical cynicism, but when he realized that Menely and Siebel took no notice of her mannerisms and had sought out her company from everyone in the busy cavern, he came to the reluctant conclusion that there must be more to her than was obvious. Beauty landed on Menely's shoulder just then, chirruping with some petulance, her eyes whirling reddishly. Diver swooped to Menely's other shoulder just as Kimmy landed on Siebel's. Rocky, to Pimer's intense delight, came to roost on his. "I thought that was Rocky," Miriam said, pointing accusingly at Pimer as if he ought to have a fire lizard anyhow. "It is," said Menely with a laugh, "but Pimer helps me feed him every day, so Rocky's just reminding us he's hungry too." "Why didn't you say they hadn't been fed?" Miriam bounced to her feet, scowling with disapproval. "Really, Menely, I'd thought you'd take care of your friends first." Siebel and Menely exchanged guilty smiles as Miriam stalked off to a table where women were cutting up wherries for the hatching feast. She returned with a generous bowl full of scraps, 3 fire lizards hovering anxiously above her. She shooed them away, reminding them with gruff affection that they'd already been fed. To Pimer's relief, because he was developing an antipathy to her manner, Miriam was called away to one of the main hearths. Rocky poked his cheek imperiously, and Pimer concentrated on feeding him. "Is she a good friend of yours?" Pimer asked when the first edge of the fire lizard hunger had been eased. Siebel laughed, and Menely made a rueful grimace. "She's very good-hearted. Don't let her ways put you off," Pimer grunted. "They have." Siebel laughed again, offering Kimmy a large chunk of meat so he could get a swallow of his claw while she struggled to chew. "Miriam does take a bit of getting used to, but Menely says she'll give you the shirt off her back." "Complaining all the time, I'll wager," Pimer said. Menely's expression was solemn. She was a fosterling to Breck, and Menora's always said that it was Miriam's devoted nursing that helped Breck live after her queen was killed. "Really?" That did impress Pimer, and he looked at Miriam among the knot of women by the hearth as if this disclosure had caused her to change visibly. Please don't judge her too quickly, Pimer," said Menely, touching his arm to emphasize her request. "Well, of course, if you say so." Siebel winked at Pimer. "She says so, Pimer, and we must obey." "Oh, you," said Menely, dismissed Siebel's teasing with a scowl of irritation. "I just don't want Pimer jumping to the wrong conclusion on the basis of a few moments' meeting. When everyone knows and Siebel rolled his eyes ceilingward, that it takes time, endurance, tolerance, and luck to appreciate Miriam. Siebel ducked as Mentally threatened him with her spoon. They had finished feeding the fire lizards and sent them out to sun themselves when Miriam popped up before them again, exhaling a mighty sigh. I don't know how we're going to get everything finished in time. Why those eggs have to be so awkward in their timing. Half the Western guests will be dead of sleep and need breakfast. See? She waved towards the entrance where dragons were depositing more passengers. There's so much to be done, and I particularly want to get to this hatching. Valesa's a candidate today, you know. So Fëanor told us. I could manage the breakfast hearth, Miriam, said Mentally. Just set us a task, said Siebel, throwing his arm across Pimer's shoulders, and we'll do our best to assist. Oh, would you? Suddenly, the affected manners dropped, and Miriam's scowl gave way to an incredulous smile of relief, illuminating her face and making her a very pretty girl. If you would just set up those tables, and she pointed to stacks of trestles and tops, that'll be the greatest help. She was again summoned across the cavern and dashed off with a smile of such unaffected gratitude that Pimer stared after her in astonishment. Why did this girl act so oddly? She was much nicer when she was just herself. So Falessen stands on the hatching ground, said Siebel. I missed that this morning. Sorry, thought I told you, said Mentally, rising to clear the table of their dishes. I wonder if he'll impress. Why shouldn't he? Asked Pimer, startled by her doubt. He may be the son of the Weir leaders, but that doesn't necessarily mean he'll impress. Dragon choice can't be forced. Oh, Falessen will impress, said a dragon rider, approaching the small hearth. Two others just behind him. Are you tending the pot, Mentally? And a good day to you, to Gellin, Mentally said with a pert smile for the bronze rider as she poured claw for him. How's yourself, Siebel? To Gellin went on, seating himself on the bench and gesturing to the other riders to join him. Hard put upon, said Siebel in a long-suffering tone that sounded suspiciously like an imitation of Miriam. We just got organized to set up the tables. Come on, Pimer, before Miriam lays about us with her ladle. Because Mentally had so stoutly championed Miriam, Pimer kept an eye out for the girl as he and Siebel arranged the additional tables. He spotted Miriam dashing from one hearth to another, called to assist in trussing weirs for roasting, herd beasts for the spit. He watched her organize one group of youngsters to peel roots and tubers and another to laying the tables with utensils and platters. He decided that Miriam had not been puffing up her responsibilities. Mentally, too, was kept busy, feeding dragon riders and their sleepy-eyed passengers, dragged from their beds for the imminent hatching. Siebel and Pimer had just set up the last table when a faint hum reached their ears. Fire lizards reappeared in the cavern, the high notes of their chirruping a counter cadence to the low bass throb of humming dragons. Miriam, divested of her apron and brushing water stains from her skirt, came dashing towards them. Come on, Oharan promised to save us all seats by him, she cried, and led the way across the bowl at a run. The Weir Harper had kept them places in the tiers above the hatching ground, though he informed them his life had been threatened by holders and craftmasters. Pimer could see why as he settled down, for this was a splendid position in the second tier, close to the entrance, so that the view of the entire ground was clear. There was no queen egg for Ramath to guard, so the Bendon queen dragon was standing to one side of the ground, Lessa and Falar on that ledge above her. Occasionally, the enormous golden dragon looked up at her Weir mate, as if seeking assurance or, Pimer thought, consolation, since the eggs she had clutched were shortly to be taken from her care. The notion amused Pimer, for he'd never have ascribed maternal emotions to Bendon's preeminent queen dragon. Certainly Ramath and her yellow flashing eyes and restless foot-shifting, wing-rustling was a far picture from the gentle concern herd beast females or runners showed their offspring. A blur of white, seen from the corner of his eye, drew Pimer's attention to the hatching ground entrance. The candidates were approaching the eggs, their white tunics fluttering in the light morning breeze. Pimer suppressed his amusement as the boys, stepping further on the hot sands, began to pick up their feet smartly. When they had reached the clutch, they ranged themselves in a loose semicircle about the gently rocking eggs. Ramath made a noise like a disapproving growl, which the boys all ignored, but Pimer noticed that the ones nearest her edged surreptitiously away. A startled murmur ran through the audience as one of the eggs rocked more violently. The sudden snapping of the shell seemed to resound through the high-ceilinged cavern, and the dragons on the upper ledges hummed more loudly than ever with encouragement. The actual hatching had begun. Pimer didn't know where to look because the audience was as fascinating as the hatching. Dragon riders' faces with soft glows as they relived the magic moment when they had impressed the hatchling dragons who became their life's companions, minds indissolubly linked. On other faces was hope, breathless and incredulous, as guests and parents of the candidates waited for the moment when their lads would be chosen or rejected by the hatchlings. Fire lizards, respectfully quiet, perched on many shoulders in the ground, and Pimer, who could never aspire to impress a dragon, was reminded of that unfilled promise that he would have a fire lizard one day. He wondered if Menelly remembered her promise to him, or if he'd ever have the opportunity to remind her of it. "There's Felessen," said Menelly, nudging him sharply with her elbow. She pointed to a leggy figure with such a luxuriant growth of dark curling hair that his head seemed oversized. "He doesn't even look nervous," said Pimer, as he noted the signs of apprehension on the other candidates who shifted uneasily or twitched unnecessarily at their tunics. A concerted gasp directed their attention from Felessen, and they saw that several more eggs were rocking violently as the hatchlings struggled to be free. Abruptly, an egg split open, and a moist little brown dragon was spilled to his feet on the hot sands. Dragging his fragile-looking damp wings on the ground, he began to lunge this way and that, calling piteously, while the adult dragons crooned encouragement, reinforced by Rameth's half-turn, half-howl. The boys nearest the dragonette tried to anticipate his direction, hoping to impress him, but he lurched out of their immediate circle, staggering across the sands, his call plaintive, desperate, until the next group of boys turned. One, prompted by some instinct, took a step forward. The little brown's cries turned joyous. He tried to extend his wet wings to bridge the distance between them, but the boy rushed to the dragon's side, caressing head and shoulders, patting the damp wings, while the little hatchling crooned with triumph, his jeweled eyes glowing the blue and purple of love and devotion. The day's first impression had been made. Pimer heard Menelly's deep and satisfied sigh, and knew that she was reliving the moment she had impressed her fire lizards in the Dragonstone's cave 3 turns ago. He was again assailed by a deep stab of envy. When would he rate a fire lizard? Excited cries brought his attention back to the hatching ground as more eggs cracked, exposing their occupants. "Watch, Felessen! Pimer! There's a bronze near him," cried Miriam, grabbing Pimer's arm in her excitement. "And 2 browns and a blue," added Menelly, scarcely less excited as she canted her body in a mental effort to direct the little bronze towards Felessen. "He deserves a bronze. He deserves one. Only if the dragon wants him," said Miriam sententiously. "Just because he's the Weir Leader's son." "Shut up, Miriam," said Pimer, exasperated, clenching his fists, urging the impression to incur. Felessen was aware of the bronze's proximity, but so were a handful of other candidates. The little creature, rocking unstable on his wobbly legs, seemed not to see any of them for a moment. Then the wedge-shaped head fell forward and got buried in the sand as his hind legs overbalanced him. It was too much. Felessen gently righted the little beast and then stood transfixed, the expression on his exultant face plainly visible to his friends as impression was made. Rameth's bugle astonished everyone into a long moment of silence, but it was no wonder, Pimer thought, that Falar and Lessa were embracing each other at the sight of their one child impressing a bronze. The excitement was over too soon, Pimer thought, just moments later. He wished that all the eggs hadn't hatched at once, so this dizzy happiness could be extended. Not that there wasn't some disappointment and sadness, too, because far more candidates were presented to the eggs than could impress. Only one little green had not impressed, and she was mewling unhappily, butting one boy out of her way, lurching to another, and peering up into his face, obviously searching for just the right lad. She had worked her way towards the tiers, despite the efforts of the remaining candidates to attract her attention and keep her well out into the ground. "Whatever is the matter with those boys?" demanded Miriam, frowning with anxiety over the little green's pathetic wandering. She stood up, gesturing peremptorily to the candidates to close around the little green. Just then the creature began to croon urgently and made directly for the steps that led up to the tiers. What is possessing her? Miriam asked no one in particular. She looked behind her accusingly, as if somehow a candidate might be hiding among the guests. She wants someone not in the crowd, rang a voice from the crowd. She's going to hurt herself, said Miriam in an agitated mutter, and pushed past the three people seated between her and the stairs. She'll bruise her wings on the walls. The little green did hurt herself, slipping off the first step and banging her muzzle so sharply on the stone that she let out a cry of pain, echoed by a fierce bugle from Ramoth, who began to move across the sands. Now listen here, you silly thing. The boys you want are out there on the ground. Turn yourself around and go back to them, Miriam was saying as she made her way down the steps to the little green. Her fire lizards, calling out in wildly ecstatic buglings, halted her. She stared for a long moment at the antics of her friends, and then, her expression incredulous, she looked down at the green hatchling determinedly, attacking the obstacle of steps. I can't, Miriam cried, so panic-stricken that she slipped from the steps herself and slid down 3 before her flailing hands found support. I can't. Miriam glanced about her for confirmation. I'm not supposed to impress. I'm not a candidate. She can't want me. Awe washed over the consternation on her face and her voice. If it's you she wants, Miriam, get down there before she hurts herself, said Falar, who had by now reached the scene, Lessa beside him. But I'm not. It would seem that you are, Miriam, said Lessa, her face reflecting amusement and resignation. The dragon's never wrong. Come, be quick about it, girl. She's scraping her chin raw to get to you. With one final startled look at the wereleaders, Miriam half slid the remaining steps, cushioning the little green's chin from yet another harsh contact with the stone of the step. Oh, you silly darling, whatever made you choose me? Miriam said in a loving voice as she gathered the green into her arms and began to soothe the hatchling's distressed cries. She says her name is Path. The glory on Miriam's face caused Pimer to look away in embarrassment and envy. For one brief moment, Pimer had entertained the bizarre notion that maybe the little green dragon had been looking for him. A deep sigh fluttered through his lips, and a hand was laid gently on his shoulder. Schooling his expression, he turned to see Menelly watching him, a deep pity and understanding in her eyes. I promised you turns ago that you'd have a fire lizard, Pimer. I haven't forgotten. I will keep that promise. As one, they turned their heads back to watch Miriam fussing over her path with her fire lizards, hopping about on the sands, chattering away as if welcoming the little green to in their own fashion. Come on, you two, said Sibyl, as Miriam began to encourage Path to walk out of the hatching ground. We'd better see Master Robinson. This is going to cause problems. The last he said in a low voice. Why? Asked Pimer, making sure they weren't overheard. But everyone was filling out of the tears now, eager to congratulate or condole. She's werebred. Greens are fighting dragons, began Sibyl. In that case, Miriam's well paired, isn't she? Asked Pimer with droll amusement. Pimer! At Menelly's shocked remonstrance, Pimer turned to Sibyl and saw an answered gleam, though the journeyman turned quickly and started down the steps. My bad. Sibyl's right, though, Menelly said thoughtfully as they started across the hot sands, quickening their pace as the heat penetrated the soles of their flying boots. Why? Asked Pimer again. Just because she's a girl? There won't be as much shock as there might be, Sibyl went on. Jackson's impression of Ruth set a precedent. It's not quite the same thing, Sibyl, Menelly replied. Jackson is a lord holder and has to remain so. And then the Weirmen did think the little white dragon mightn't live. And now he has, and it's obvious he's never going to be a full-size dragon. Not that he's needed in the Weirs, but Miriam is. Exactly. And not in the capacity of Green Rider. I think she'd make a good fighting rider, said Pimer, keeping the comment carefully under his breath. When they located Master Robinson, he was already earnestly discussing the matter with Oran. Completely unexpected, Miriam swears that she hadn't been in the hatching ground at all when the candidates were familiarizing themselves with the eggs, Master Robinson told his craftsman. Then he smiled. Fortunately, with Felison impressing a bronze, Lessa and Falar are in great spirits. Now, he shrugged, his grin broadening, it was simply a case of the dragon finding her own partnership where she wanted it, as Ruth did with Jackson. Precisely. And that is the Harper message? Asked Sibyl, glancing about the bowl where knots of people surrounded weirlings and dragonettes. There doesn't seem to be any other explanation, so let us drink and be merry. It's a good day for Pern, and I'm terribly dry," said the master harper, as the weir harper solemnly proffered a cup of wine. "Oh, thanks, Oran. I must be the heat of the hatching ground or excitement. I'm parched." Ah! The harper's sigh was of relief and pleasure. "A good Bendon vintage. Ah, an old one. The wine has a mellowness, a smoothness." He glanced about him as his audience waited expectantly. Oran's hand casually covered the seal of the wineskin. The harper took another judicious sip. "Yes, indeed, I have it now, the pressing of 10 turns back, and furthermore," he held up a finger, "it's from the northwestern slopes of Upper Bendon." Oran slowly uncovered the seal, and the others saw that the harper had been absolutely correct. "I don't know how you do it, Master Robinson," said Oran, having hoped to confound his master. "He's had a lot of practice," said Meneley at her driest, and they all laughed as Master Robinson started to protest. They had time for a quiet glass before the admiring guests had exhausted all the possible things one could say to a newly impressed pair. Then the whirling master took his charges off to the lake, where the newly hatched would be fed, bathed, and oiled, and the guests began to drift towards the tables, seating themselves for the feasting that would follow. Master Robinson led his craftsmen in a rousing ballad of praise to dragons and their riders before he joined the weir leaders and their visiting lord holders. Oran, Siebel, Meneley, and Pimer did the courtesy round to the tables where the parents of new dragon riders were seated, singing requests. Meneley's fire lizard sang several songs with her before she excused them, explaining that they were far more interested in the new dragons than singing for mere people. Then she got involved with a group from the craft hall at Bitra, and the other 3 harpers left her explaining how to teach fire lizards to sing as they continued the rounds. The tradition was that a harper's song deserved a cup of wine. Chattering as they drank, Siebel and Oran took turns directing conversation where they wished it. Miriam's unexpected impression. There was, to be sure, considerable surprise that Miriam had done so, but most of those queried found it to be of no large affair. After all, they said, Miriam was weir-bred, a fosterling of Breck's, had impressed 3 of the first fire lizards to be found at Southern, so her unexpected rise to a dragon rider was at least consistent. Now Jackson, who had to remain Lord of Rotha, was a different case entirely. Pimer noticed that everyone was a good deal interested in the health of the little white dragon, and while they wished him the best, they were just as pleased that he'd never make a full-sized beast. Evidently, they made it easier for people to accept the fact that Ruth was being raised in a hold instead of a weir. Holdlessness was a topic of which conversations returned time and again that evening. Many lads growing up in a landcrafts would not find holdings of their own when they were old enough. There simply weren't any old places left. Could not more of the mountainous regions of the far north be made habitable, or the remote slopes or high reaches in Crom? Pimer noted that Nebol, which actually had tenable land uncultivated, was never sighted. What about the marshlands or lower Bendon? Surely, with such a competent weir, more holds could be protected. Occasionally, Pimer, standing or sitting at the edges of groups, would overhear fascinating snatches and try to make sense out of them. Mostly, he discarded them as gossip, but one stuck in his tired mind. Lord Oterel had been the speaker. He didn't know the other man, though his lighter clothes suggested he came from the southern part of Pern. Miran gets more than his share. We go without. Girls impress fighting dragons, and our lad stands on the ground. Ridiculous. Pimer found it getting progressively harder to rise from one table and move to another. Not that he was drinking any wine. He had sense enough not to do that. He just seemed to be more tired than he ought to be. If he could just put his head down for a few moments. That was me tonight. He was scarcely conscious of the cold of between, only annoyed because he was being forced to walk when he wanted to sit down. He did recall some sort of argument going on over his head. He could have sworn it was Sylvina giving someone the very rough edge of her tongue. He was mercifully grateful that, finally, he was permitted to stretch out on a bed, feel furs pulled over his shoulders, and he could give in to the sleep he craved. The bell woke him, and his surroundings confused him. He looked about, trying to figure out where he was, since he certainly wasn't in the drum apprentice's quarters. Further, he was on a rush bag on a floor, the floor in Siebel's room, for the clothes Siebel had been wearing for the past 2 days were draped on a nearby chair, his flying boots sagging against each other by the bed. Pimer's emptied clothes had been neatly piled on his boots at the foot of the rush bag. The bell continued to ring, and Pimer, keenly aware of the emptiness of his belly, hastily dressed, paused long enough to splash his face and hands with water in case anyone like Durzen wanted to fault him on cleanliness, and proceeded down the corridor to the steps and the dining hall. He was just turning into the hall when Clell and the other 3 came in the main door. Clell flashed a look at the others and then strode up to Pimer, grabbing him by the arm roughly. "Where have you been for 2 days? Why? Did you have to polish the drums?" "You're going to get it from Durzen." A pleased smirk crossed Clell's face. "Why should he get it from Durzen?" Clell asked mentally, quietly coming up behind the drum apprentices. "He's been on Harper business." "He's always getting off on Harper business," replied Clell with unexpected anger, "and always with you." Pimer raised his fist at such insolence and leaned back to make the swing count in Clell's sneering face. But Mentally was quicker. She swung the apprentice about and shoved him forcefully towards the main door. "Insolence to a journeyman means water rations for you, Clell," she said, and, without bothering to see that he'd continued out of the hall, she turned to the other 3 who gawked at her. "And for you, too, if you should learn of any mischief against Pimer because of this. Have I made myself perfectly clear, or do I need to mention the incident to Master Oldkey?" Go Mentally. The cowed apprentices murmured the necessary assurances and, at her dismissal, lost themselves in a throng of other apprentices. "How much trouble have you been having in the drum heights, Pimer?" "Nothing I can't handle," said Pimer, wondering when he could get back at Clell for that insult to Mentally. "Water rations for you too, Pimer, if I see so much as a scratch on Clell's face." "But he—" Bonds, Timney, and Broly came flying into the hall at that point and hailed Pimer with such evident relief that after giving Pimer a long, forbidding glance, Mentally went off towards the journeyman's tables. The boys demanded to know where he'd been, and he was to tell them everything. He didn't. He told them what he felt they should know as far as the Eigenhold gather was concerned, an innocuous enough tale, and he could and did describe in great detail the impression of Path to Miriam. The bare bones of that unexpected event was already the talk of the hall, and Pimer had heard the public version so often that he knew he wasn't committing any indiscretions. He was careful to play down, even on to his good friends, the circumstances that had brought him to Bend and Weir at such an auspicious occasion. No dragon rider was going to take me and Apprentice Harper all the way back to the hall when there was a hatching, so I had to stay. "Come on, Pimer," said Bonds, thoroughly disgusted with his indifference. "You can't ever get me to believe that you didn't enjoy every moment of it." "Then I won't, 'cause I did. But I was just bloody lucky to be at the Eigen gather right then. Otherwise, I'd have been back polishing the big drums yesterday. Say, Pimer, you getting on all right with Clell and the others?" asked Ranley. "Sure, why?" Pimer kept his voice as casual as he could. "Oh, nothing, except they're not mixers, and lately they've been sort of asking about you in a funny sort of way." Ranley was worried. From the solemn expressions on the others' faces, he had confided their concern. "You just haven't been the same since your voice changed, Pimer," said Timony, blushing with his embarrassment. Pimer snorted, then grinned, because Timony looked so uncomfortable. "Of course I'm not, Tim. How could I be? My voice is changing, and the rest of me, too." "I didn't mean that," said Tim, and Timony faltered in a muddle of confusion, looking at Bonds and Brawley for help to express what puzzled them all. Just then the journeyman rose to give out the day's assignments, and the apprentices were forced to be quiet. Pimer held his breath, hoping that Mentally had not made Clell's discipline a public one, and felt relieved when it was obvious that she hadn't. He was going to have enough trouble with Clell as it is. Not that he worried about the apprentice going hungry. He'd seen the other 3 secreting bread, fruit, and a thick, weary slice to smuggle out to him. As the sections dispersed for their work parties, Pimer went to the drum heights, wondering exactly what awaited him. He was not surprised to find that the drums had been left for him to polish, or that Durzen grumbled about his absence, because how could he learn enough to be a proper drummer? And it was only to be expected that there was no word of praise from Durzen when he came out measure perfect on all the sequences Durzen asked him. What Pimer wasn't prepared for was the state of his belongings when Durzen dismissed him. He got the first whiff when he opened the door to the apprentice's room. Despite the fact that both windows were propped wide open, the small room smelled like the necessary. He opened the press for clean clothes and realized where the worst of the offending stench lay. He turned, half hoping this was all, but as he ran his hand over his sleeping furs, they were disgustingly damp. "Who's been—" Durzen came striding into the room, finger and thumb pinching his nose against the odor. Pimer said nothing. He merely let the soiled clothing unroll and held the furs up so that the light fell on the long, damp stain. Durzen's eyes narrowed and his grimace deepened. Pimer wondered what annoyed Durzen more, that Pimer's unexpectedly long absence had made the joke more noisome than necessary, or that there was proof enough positive that Pimer was being harassed by his roommates. "You may be excused from other duties to attend to this," said Durzen. "Be sure to bring back a sweet candle to clear the odor." How could they sleep with that? Durzen waited until Pimer had cleared the nauseous things from the room, and then he slammed the door with such force that the journeyman was on watch came to see what was the matter. With everyone scattered for work sections, Pimer managed to get to the washing room without being stopped. He was so furious he wouldn't have trusted himself to answer properly if anyone had asked him the most civil of questions. He slapped the furs, hair side out, into the warm tub, sprinkling half the jar of sweet sand on the slowly sinking bedding. He shook the half-hardened stuff out of his clothing into the drain and then, with washing paddle, shoved and prodded the garments to loosen the incrustations. If there were stains on his new clothes, he'd face a month's water rations, but he'd pay them all back, so he would. "What are you doing in here at this time of day, Pimer?" asked Sylvina, attracted by the splashing and pounding. "Me?" The force of his tone brought Sylvina right into the room. "My roommates play dirty jokes." Sylvina gave him a long, searching look as her nose told her what kind of dirty jokes. Any reason for them to? In a split second, Pimer decided Sylvina was one of the few people in the hall he could trust. She instinctively knew when he was shamming, so she'd know now that he was being put on, and he had had an unbearable need and urge to release some of the troubles he had suppressed. This last trick of the apprentice's, damaging his good new clothes, hurt more than he had realized in the numbness following the discovery. He'd been so proud of the fine garments, and to have them crudely soiled before he'd worn some of them enough to acquire honest dirt hit him harder than the slanders at his supposed indiscretions. "I get to gathers and impressions," Pimer drew a whistling breath through his teeth, "and I've made the mistake of learning drum measures too fast and too well." Sylvina continued to stare at him, her eyes slightly narrowed and her head tilted to one side. Abruptly, she moved beside him and took the washed paddle from his hand, slipping it deftly under the soaking furs. "They probably expected you back right after the Eigen gather," she chuckled as she plunged the fur back under the water, grinning broadly at him. "So they had to sleep in the stink they caused for 2 nights." Her laughter was infectious, and Pimer found his spirits lifting as he grinned back at her. "That Clell. He's the one who planned it. Watch him, Pimer. He's got a mean streak." Then she sighed. "Still, you won't be there long, and it won't do you any harm to learn the drum measures. Could be very useful one day." She gave him another long, appraising look. "I'll say this for you, Pimer. You know when to keep your tongue in your head. Here, put that through the wringer now, and let's see if we've got the worst of it out." Sylvina helped him finish the washing, asking him all about the hatching and Miriam's unexpected impression of a green dragon, and how did he find the climate in Eigen. It was as much a relief for him to talk to Sylvina without restraint as to have her expert help in cleaning his clothes. Then, because she said nothing would be dry before evening, she got him another sleeping fur and a spare shirt and pants, commenting they were well enough worn not to cause envy. "You'll mention, of course, that I tore strips out of you for ruining good cloth and staining fur," she said with a parted wink. He was halfway out of the hall when he remembered the need for a sweet candle and went back for it, bearing her loud grumbles to the rest of the kitchen with fortitude. Afterwards, Pimer thought that if Durzen had ignored the mischief the way Pimer intended to, the whole incident might have been forgotten. But Durzen reprimanded the others in front of the journeymen and put them on water rations for 3 days. The sweet candle cleared the quarters of the stench, but nothing would ever sweeten the apprentices towards Pimer after that. It was almost as if Pimer thought Durzen was determined to ruin any chance Pimer had of making friends with Clell or the others. Though he did his best to stay out of their vicinities, he was constantly having benches shoved into his shins in the study room, his feet trod on everywhere, his ribs painfully stuck by drumsticks or elbows. His furs were sewn together 3 nights running, and his clothes were so frequently dipped in the roof gutters that he finally asked Brawley to make him a locking mechanism for his press that he alone could open. Jeez. Apprentices were not supposed to have any private containers, but Durzen made no mention of the addition to Pimer's box. In a way, Pimer found a certain satisfaction in being able to ignore the nuisances, rising above all the pettiness perpetrated on him with massive and complete disdain. He spent as much time as he could studying the drum records, tapping his fingers on his fur, even as he was falling asleep, to memorize the times and rhythms of the most complicated measures. He knew the others knew exactly what he was doing, and there was nothing they could do to thwart him. Unfortunately, the coolness he developed to fend off their little tricks began insidiously to come between him and his old friends. Bonds and Brawley complained loudly that he was different, while Timony watched him with mournful eyes, as if he somehow considered himself responsible for Pimer's alterations. Pimer tried to laugh it off, saying he was drum happy. They're putting on you up in the drum heights, Pimer, said Bonds, glowing loyally. I just know they are. And if Clell isn't, Pimer said in a tone so fierce that Bonds rocked back on his heels. That's exactly what I mean, Pimer, said Brawley, who wasn't easily intimidated by a boy he'd known for 5 turns, and still topped by a full head. You're different, and don't give me that old wheeze about your voice changing and you with it. Your voice is settling. You haven't cracked in days. Pimer blinked, mildly surprised at the phenomenon of which he'd been unaware. It's too bad. Anyhow, Tilgren's got the part down, finally, and it wouldn't sound the same with you as baritone, Brawley went on. Baritone? Pimer's voice broke in surprise, and when he saw the disappointment on his friends' faces, he started to laugh. Well, maybe, and then maybe not. Now, you sound like Pimer, said Bonds, shouting with emphasis, isolated as he'd been in the drum heights. Pimer had easily managed to forget the fast-approaching feast at Lord Grove's and the performance of Domic's new music. 2 7 days had passed since the Bendon hatching, and he'd been too engrossed with his own problems to give much attention to extraneous matters. His friends now underlined the nearest of the feast, and he was sure that he couldn't escape attending it, and wondered how he could. He'd prefer to be out of Fort Hold altogether on the night of the performance, because, sure as eggs cracked, he'd have to go to it. Then it occurred to him that he hadn't been on any trips with Siebel and Menely lately. He forced himself to laugh and joke with his friends in a fair imitation of his old self, but once back on the drum heights, while he stood his afternoon watch, he began to wonder if he'd done something wrong at Bendon Weir or Eigenhold, or if by any freak chance Durzen's tittle-tattle had affected Menely's opinion of him. Come to think of it, he hadn't seen Siebel at all of late. The next morning, when he was feeding the fire lizards with her, he asked her where the journeyman was. Between you and me, she said in a low voice, having seen Camo occupied with the greedy Auntie One, he's up in the ranges. He should be back tonight. Don't worry, Pimer, she said, smiling. We haven't forgotten you. Then she gave him a very searching look. You haven't been worried, have you? Me? Nah, why should I worry? He gave a derisive snort. I put my time to good use. I know more drum measures than any of those dimwits, for all they've been mucking about up there for turns. Menely laughed. Now you sound more like yourself. You're all right with Master Oldkey, then? Me? Sure, which Pimer felt was not stretching the truth. He was fine with Master Oldkey because he rarely came in contact with the man. I can hear him snoring from here. And that rough lad, Clell, he's not come back at you for the other day, has he? Menely, said Pimer, taking a stern tone with her. I'm Pimer. No one gets back at me. What gave you such a notion? He sounded as scornful as he could. Just that you haven't been as well. And she smiled half apologetically. "Oh, never mind. I expect you can take care of yourself anytime, anywhere." They continued feeding the fire lizards, and Pimer wished heartily that he could tell mentally the real state of affairs in the Drum Heights. But what good would it do? She could only speak to Durzen, who would never accept Pimer for any reason. Asking Durzen to discipline the other apprentices for what was only stupid petty narking wouldn't help. Pimer could see clearly now that his well-founded reputation for mischief and game-playing was coming back at him when he least expected it, or even less deserved it. He'd no one but himself to fault, so he'd just have to chew it raw and swallow. After all, once his voice settled, he'd be out of the Drum Heights. He could put up with it because he'd have the odd gather out with Siebel and Menely. No, JJ's definitely asleep. I can hear him from here. So, anyway, that's all for tonight. We just finished chapter 4. It only took us 2 sessions. I love you guys. Rebecca, Granny Bear. Good night, and we will